Do you normally advise your clients when they're buying their primary residences to buy those in their personal names and then possibly look at other vehicles for other investment properties?
Yeah, so absolutely. No, that's a big factor looking at that
Yeah.
R2 million exemption from capital gains.
Yeah.
When we look at what vehicles to own property in, cost is a big one to look at,
Yes.
then tax, and then risk. And all those factors play their part. People at their stages of life have different considerations as well, but ultimately my default to clients is to first, when they're buying their primary residence, if that's where they're going to live at the end of the day, look at doing that in your personal name.
Yeah.
The costs are the cheapest ultimately in your personal name.
Yes.
And you get that allowance from capital gains tax down the line. And then if there are considerations specifically that may make you want to think about risk or not having it in your personal name, look at that as a default. But generally speaking, primary residence in your personal name makes the most sense from a cost and from a tax consideration. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carol Reynolds and welcome to the Property Pod. Today we're going to be talking about different types of property ownership. Should you buy a property in a trust? Is it better to own in your personal capacity? And joining me to unpack this topic is Chartered Accountant Marco Araujo, who's also the financial advisor at Araujo Attorneys. Hi Marco, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. I have to just compliment you. I believe you were Dux at Northwood and you got the highest marks in your accounting board exam.
Yeah, many years ago. Thank you.
Gosh, those are pretty impressive accolades. And then you've had a little bit of a jaunt in the corporate space. You worked at Deloitte, at KPMG, and now you're working with your wife.
That's right, yeah. So I started out with KPMG in Durban, did my articles here locally, then spent a little bit of time in London, and then went in seek of adventure as you do as a young professional. Ended up in Bermuda with Deloitte, working in hedge funds and traveling around there for a while, and then ultimately came back and settled back in South Africa, joined Trellidor in the corporate space, worked there for a number of years, financial director for a couple of years there. And then my wife, Sarah, had started Araujo Attorneys and decided to look for that elusive family balance and joined her in the business and been there for 10 years going strong now.
And haven't looked back.
And not looked back at all.
Good. Okay, well, let's talk about legal entities. So starting with a primary residence, obviously SARS has a capital gains tax exemption for people who own their homes in their personal capacity, and that's up to 2 million Rand, which is quite a lot of a reprieve. So do you normally advise your clients when they're buying their primary residences to buy those in their personal names and then possibly look at other vehicles for other investment properties?
Yeah, so absolutely. No, that's a big factor looking at that R2 million exemption from capital gains. When we look at what vehicles to own property in, cost is a big one to look at, then tax, and then risk. And all those factors play their part. People at their stages of life have different considerations as well, but ultimately my default to clients is to first, when they're buying their primary residence, if that's where they're going to live at the end of the day, look at doing that in your personal name. The costs are the cheapest ultimately in your personal name, and you get that allowance from capital gains tax down the line. And then if there are considerations specifically that may make you want to think about risk or not having it in your personal name, look at that as a default. But generally speaking, primary residence in your personal name makes the most sense from a cost and from a tax consideration.
Perfect. And I suppose it also depends on stage of life. So when you're young and you're planning on buying a property, maybe upgrading and selling, and there will be little gains as you buy and sell, then it's important to do it in your own name. But when you get to my age, you start thinking about your children and your legacy, and that's when you start to really dive into things like trusts, where estate planning becomes important. So I imagine that as people's lives unfold, you then advise them that possibly at a later stage in their lives, maybe to consider even putting their primary residence into a trust.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. You know, we all have different stages of life, different needs and concerns. Kids bring on that whole aspect of leaving a legacy, making sure they're better off than we were, and making sure our wealth hands down, hopefully, to those kids, to our kids as well. And yes, you know, when you are young, you're starting out. Generally, if you're on your own or with a spouse or a partner, it starts as a small apartment, hopefully, and then grows into something a bit bigger as kids, and then a bigger house, and so you go, and then it reaches the stage where your kids move out, and now you don't need all that space, and then you downscale, right? And at that stage, you're probably not buying and selling as much, and so the tax question mark isn't such a big consideration anymore, and you start looking at estate planning, and then a trust absolutely comes into play, because if that property then potentially leaves to your kids, you want it to be the least tax coming off there, and estate duty is a big one to consider ultimately.
Sure,
so that definitely is something at stage in life to look at as a differential to where you were originally.
Perfect. And the conduit principle, I know that it's sort of been in the spotlight for a few years. Do you think that will ever be abolished? And if so, then obviously we're only going to look at trusts from an estate planning perspective. There are no other sort of tax benefits prior to that. So what is your feeling around the conduit principle?
Yeah, I think any taxes, ultimately tax experts, us accountants, we always try and see what's the least amount of tax that you can pay at the end of the day, and working within the laws to make sure that it is minimal. And SARS's job then becomes like, how are you getting around these taxes? What are you doing illegally? How do we short circuit this a little bit so that at the end of the day they're getting the most tax revenue as well? So you end up in this little battle. And with the conduit principle, it has been that over a few years, people structuring multiple trust tiers, so it gets complex, but ultimately from a tax perspective, then trying to feed it down so there's minimal tax in there, and SARS turning around saying, well, this doesn't work for us. So I think the conduit principle has been highlighted. There have been some talks, but I don't see it really getting abolished. Maybe something along the lines of SARS fine-tuning the rules to make sure that some of those little loopholes essentially aren't there. But ultimately, it serves its purpose at the end of the day. So I don't think it'll go away, but we might have to relook at where the loopholes are.
A little. Yeah. So, I mean, that also raises the issue of complexity. I mean, the more simple life is, the cheaper it is. And sometimes there's a lot to be said for simplicity. But if you were to advise someone, what's your sort of go-to structure? Should you have a trust? Should you have a company? Should one own the other? What would your advice be?
Yeah. So again, we look at those core principles of cost, risk, and tax. If you're starting out in life, your first investment property, maybe you're a young professional, got a bit of capital, and you want to put your foot in the water and see what's out there, you don't want to spend a lot of money on costs. So setting up a company, setting up a trust, you need advisors, you need accountants, you need independent trustees that come with a cost and a trust as well. So the cheapest is still to put it in your personal name. At a lower investment property, your potential tax burdens aren't going to be significantly high. So often it still makes sense in your personal name when you're starting out. But then as you get a bit, I wouldn't even say older, because a lot of youngsters have the wealth as well. But as you accumulate wealth or look to grow a property portfolio, then you can look at the bit more complexity. There's going to be cost, but it's going to be more efficient from a tax planning perspective and more efficient from an estate planning perspective. And in there, probably the most popular vehicle in use at the moment when structuring is something where there's a trust on the top side. The trust owns a company. The company invests in the property. Ultimately. And so you get kind of the best of a few worlds there, because the trust at the top level gives you that estate planning side of things and the continuity of the whole vehicle as such. And it also gives you the risk protection. And then the company gives you a little bit more freedom of operations. There's not the independent trustee within the company. You can structure tax a bit better within the company as well. So it gives you kind of the best of a few worlds within that vehicle. And that, why we say that is more on a longer term planning and a bit more wealth, is because obviously that comes with cost and complexity, like you say. That's not simple.
No.
At the end of the day, you got to know where the loans are. You got to know how one talks to the other. You got to make sure your returns are all in order. And so that takes a bit more homework and making sure that you've ultimately got the right people on the bus with you, ensuring that that whole vehicle is working well.
And that brings me to another question. So with trust, you have to have an independent trustee. That's quite an important factor to bear in mind. And where do you find these independent trustees, and who should you be looking at? An accountant, an attorney? Any advice with regards to that?
So yes, independent trustees over the years, I think there's been a lot of spotlight on independent trustees and making sure that they are performing their job at the end of the day. And it's not just, I think in the old days it was your neighbor, could be your independent trustee or your best mate, hey, come sign here and let's carry on. SARS has cracked down on that a bit as well. And so that independent trustee needs to be somebody who understands the financial world, understands what a trust is, what their duties are. So generally speaking, accountants, attorneys, financial advisors, those kind of people fill into those roles. And their job is there to make sure that that trust is doing what it was mandated to do at the end of the day, and not just ticking a box. And that has pros and cons, right? Because if you've got property in a trust, you want to make the decisions and get on with things, but you need that independent trustee to buy into what you want as well,
your views,
ultimately. But they are there to say, hey, why are you doing that? Let's think about it this way as well. So that's the pros and cons.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you touched on risk, which I think is a big one. So if you are setting up all these structures, I suppose you might want to ring fence any company that's potentially risky. Maybe it's a company that you're trading in your normal business.
Yeah.
And then have a separate entity for your assets and ownership of those investments.
Yeah. So absolutely, with risk, especially I think in a South African and maybe even in Durban context, entrepreneurship, doing your own thing is out there a lot and spoken about a lot.
It is.
But that comes with risk, right? So the risk is, are you signing sureties, personal sureties? Do you have creditors that are not after you, but you're growing creditors as you grow your business,
Yeah.
So there is risk with that. And ultimately, if you're creating that risk and taking those chances on a business and growing a business, you don't want potentially any of that risk falling and hurting you in other areas of your life as well. So by creating separate structures, separate ownership vehicles, a trust gives you that protection from those vehicles as well. So definitely something to consider. Separation there, like you say.
Yeah. So, I think the main factors when making these decisions are risk and separating assets, tax, capital gains tax, transfer duty, all those other implications, estate planning, and then, as you say, costs.
Yes.
So you'll weigh up all of those factors when advising your clients.
And just on that, so it's one that often clients ask about. So your transfer duty and your transfer costs in property transactions are the same across all the entities.
Yeah.
So that is one that is now consistent. That changed a number of years ago as well.
Yeah.
So that at least is consistent as opposed to some of the other costs in terms of setting up those structures that are differential.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Marco. Is there any other advice that you'd like to offer? Any other suggestions? Maybe a question that you often get asked? Anything else you'd like to share?
I think one of the biggest things when we're talking to clients about setting up these structures as well is with their long-term vision. If you think about when you're going out to get financing in your personal name, if you're getting a bond, they're looking at your individual earning capacity, what your salary is, how much you're earning, how much can you afford to pay down on the bond. Whereas if you're setting up a company or a trust that has property ownership in there, there is rental income coming through there, that creates its own separate business as such. Yes. And so that business starts to trade, and as you grow properties and grow equity in those entities, those entities can then get financing on their own. So you end up in a situation where ultimately you've got potential for financing within those entities
and more leverage
financing in your own name. So more opportunity at the end of the day. So definitely a positive there as well of creating wealth through what you
property.
have at the end of the day as well.
No, that's fantastic. I really do believe that starting a property portfolio as young as possible is such a good move. And so setting up the right structures with the end goal in mind is a great place to start.
Yeah, quite right. And on that as well, like we spoke earlier about your first investment properties in your personal name, down the line when that wealth accumulates, to transfer that into your structure is also a possibility. So you're not going to get it wrong off the bat. You can always adjust as life
over time
takes its toll or takes place and move on as well.
Yeah. Oh, no, super. Thank you so much, Marco. I've really appreciated your insights. I love your comment about financing. I think that's something that people really do need to factor in. So essentially, if you do have these separate entities, you can gear more properties and you can grow your wealth faster by using the bank's finance to help you to gear and double your wealth. So
good debt at the end of the day.
Yes.
Someone once told me there is something as good debt, and that is good debt at the end of the day.
I totally agree. Thanks, Marco. Lovely to have you here. And where can people get hold of you if they want a little bit of financial advice?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm at Araujo Attorneys. We're on social media. We're online as well, araujoattorneys.co.za. And we're always there for a cup of coffee. I'm an accountant, so I enjoy talking about this kind of stuff as well, and structuring and all the rest. So always keen for a cup of coffee and just a conversation. Doesn't cost you anything. It just sets out some benefits to both parties at the end of the day and grow together.
Super. Oh, Marco, thank you so much. It's been such fun and really interesting. And thank you so much for joining me today at our Property Pod. Really interesting insights as to how you should own your property investments, and also, again, just talking about the benefits of being a property investor. I still believe property is number one.